Hello. I wanted to start today with a recollection, a memory that will surprise precisely no one who has had the opportunity to work closely with Dr. Jennifer Freyd. And that memory is of a walking meeting with her. Jennifer frequently walks with the folks with whom she's meeting. And back in the day when I was a graduate student working with Jennifer in Eugene, Oregon at the University of Oregon, we would walk whether it was shine or rain, and it was more often the latter. It was more often raining. And this meant a couple of things. The first thing that it meant was I almost always returned from our walks looking a bit like a wet rat back to Straub Hall, the home of the psychology department. And the other thing it meant was that there wasn't an easy way to take notes during meetings. And so I developed a practice over time of going back to the third floor of Straub Hall and one of the offices in the dynamics lab. And I would take notes from our meeting, particularly on the action steps, the things that Jennifer and I agreed to do to move our work forward together. And here you have a bit of a dramatization of what a typical first year sort of student to-do list looked like from 1996-ish, working with Jennifer, where I was working on various tasks related to my first year project. And somewhere during that first year, though, we started adding to each of our to-do lists a reminder to change the world. And this just became our practice back and forth. If either of us sent a to-do list to the other person and we forgot it, the other one would add change the world onto the to-do list. And I've been thinking a lot about what this means or meant for my development as a scholar to, number one, believe that change was possible, and number two, believe that it was worth aspiring to. And certainly that aspiration for change, that commitment to change, is something that very much comes to mind when I think about the arc of Jennifer's work and the impact that her work in betrayal trauma theory have had over the last many years. From the 1996 publication of Betrayal Trauma, The Logic of Forgetting Childhood Abuse, through to the 2020 founding of the Center for Institutional Courage, and really its growth and its impact over the last couple of years. And one of the things that I think this arc demonstrates is that the path to change, to courage, to action, often begins with unawareness. Now, we can think about unawareness in a couple of different ways. It can take many forms. For example, psychiatrist Judith Herman pointed out in her landmark book, Trauma and Recovery, which was published a handful of years before Jennifer published Betrayal Trauma. In that book, Herman pointed out that we have often gone through periods of unawareness or sort of collective cultural amnesia about violence, particularly the victimization of girls and women, that it has been commonplace across points in history to ignore or even express disdain for survivors, to ignore the realities of victimization. And that those moments are bookended by periods of awareness where we pay attention to and recognize trauma, the trauma of victimization and its consequences. And Jennifer's work, of course, has happened in that cultural and also a historical context. These cycles of attention to and even disdain for survivors that have played out over the decades that Jennifer has been doing her work and developing in betrayal trauma theory and subsequent work. And so to understand the impact of betrayal trauma theory and the subsequent work, it's really important to keep this historical perspective in mind. And we can think of that historical perspective as sort of bookended by two powerful social movements, one being the women's movement of the 60s and 70s, and the other being the more contemporary Me Too movement. And both of these movements have really been about addressing our cultural unawareness, making it less taboo, making it more common to talk about the realities of victimization and violence in the lives of girls and women. And Jennifer's work, of course, has been both affected by and affected this cultural and historical arc over time. And it's in that historical and cultural context, that, of course, Jennifer's work with betrayal trauma theory began with a focus on awareness, and in this case, individual unawareness. As my colleague, Dr. Gomez, pointed out in a talk in honor of Jennifer's work, the original articulation of betrayal trauma theory focused on how and why being unaware of or minimizing awareness of abuse by a trusted person offered a way for victims to navigate and survive those necessary, though abusive, attachments. And this is indeed one of the major contributions of Jennifer's work, advancing the field's understanding of memory for trauma, particularly memory impairment. And she did this at a time when many of the conceptualizations of trauma and memory were really focused on hypermemory, on intrusive memories for traumas, such as the study of memory in the context of combat veterans' experiences from the Vietnam War. Now, what may be less obvious, but is no less important, is how betrayal trauma theory really ignited discoveries around the very nature of trauma and its harms. For example, her theory galvanized research into really the correlates of betrayal traumas, documenting a host of psychological and physical, as well as relational and cognitive harms that vary as a function of betrayal in the victim-perpetrator relationship. And she started this work at a time when the field's attention was quite focused on post-traumatic stress disorder. So she really broadened our lens for thinking about the kinds of harms that were relevant to be studying, talking about, and addressing clinically. Betrayal trauma theory also radically changed the field's understanding of the gendered nature of intimate violence and abuse. To give some context, a handful of years before Jennifer published Betrayal Trauma Theory, Lenore Terr published a groundbreaking book called Too Scared to Cry. And in that book, she distinguished between type 1 and type 2 traumas, where a type 1 trauma was a one-time occurrence, and type 2 traumas were more chronic kinds of traumas, such as abuse. And so we were at a point in history when betrayal trauma theory comes on the scene where it's important to remember that our understanding of trauma and the kind of characteristics that lead to harm were quite rudimentary. And it was also a time where we were quite squarely focused on things like fear, helplessness, and horror, again, really influenced by post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as the guiding framework. In that context, betrayal trauma theory provides a theoretical framework through which we could begin to test and understand more about how the characteristics of trauma shape responses to those events. And guided by tools that Jennifer developed and her students and colleagues, we've been able to understand more about those characteristics and how they shape responses far beyond fear, helplessness, and horror, where you see betrayal trauma theory really support advancements in the field to think about things like shame or self-blame, alienation. And the tools that Jennifer and her colleagues developed, such as the Brief Betrayal Trauma Survey, have been critical to moving that work forward. Now, across her career, then, Jennifer has really continued to be at the forefront of moving our field from unawareness to awareness about the different forms that betrayal, trauma, and harm can take. For example, her work evolved more recently to identify the way that institutions, too, can betray the people who depend upon them. Colleges and universities who create conditions where it's more likely that sexual assault will occur or cover it up when it happens. Or churches and businesses who close ranks around abusive actors, sacrificing the well-being of victims and survivors. Jennifer and her colleagues have given a name to this, institutional betrayal, and really set off a body of work that demonstrates that institutional betrayal adds to the harm of trauma. And I've really been struck by the degree to which interest in and research on institutional betrayal has taken off as one important example of many of how Jennifer has launched lines of inquiry that are timely and really of tremendous public importance. I'm aware of this, thinking about this in terms of institutional betrayal, because graduate students working with me on my team have been doing a scoping review of institutional betrayal. And I can tell you that over the last 10 years, there are now more than 36 empirical studies of institutional betrayal. So we're seeing a rapid growth in the development of this literature and understanding of this phenomenon in a relatively short amount of time. Of course, awareness and unawareness, these are not fixed states in an individual or in a culture, as both Jennifer and Judith Herman's work point to. It's perhaps no surprise then that scholars mentored by Jennifer are at the leading edge of current conversations in our field about what unawareness looks like today. From the tendency to focus on changing individual survivors instead of changing systems of injustice under the well-intentioned banner of trauma-informed care, to minimizing or missing the intersections of racialized trauma and discrimination with betrayal traumas. And the work that Jennifer and her students and collaborators have done to name forms of harm and measure them, whether it's betrayal trauma or DARVO or institutional betrayal, this work has just been essential to moving from unawareness to awareness in both scientific and public discourse. And that awareness of betrayal trauma and institutional betrayal, it's been profound, offering new perspectives, frameworks, avenues for science, for prevention, for intervention, for public engagement. But here's the thing. We've been hoping since the women's movement of the 60s and 70s that awareness would lead to transformational change. Back then in the women's movement, they called it consciousness raising. And the idea was that once people really knew about the realities of victimization and violence in women's lives, the behaviors would change, that these things would ebb. And instead, what we have seen is we find ourselves at a moment in history when awareness is greater than it has ever been for the problem of violence against women, the victimization of girls and women. And yet, intimate violence remains horribly common. Indeed, every 90 seconds, a woman is victimized by a current or former intimate partner. And in that same minute and a half, another woman is sexually assaulted. And we know that the situation is worse for women who are marginalized or minoritized based on their identities. So moving from an awareness to awareness may be necessary for change, but it's certainly not sufficient. We need action. And Jennifer really agitates, in the good community organizing sense of the term, not for any action, but for courageous action. So here we are. We find ourselves today with this incredible body of knowledge that Jennifer's work has made possible, has inspired. And we have this call that she has charged us with, a call to courage. And we have an opportunity to ask ourselves, how are we going to get from awareness to courageous action? And I'm so glad you asked, because it's something I've been thinking and writing a lot about these days. This issue of moving from unawareness to awareness and awareness to action. How do we take this moment of scientific and public awareness about violence against women and use it to lead to transformative change so that it becomes possible to imagine into existence a world that none of us has known, a world without intimate violence? We can take a page here from other social movements, from organizers and social movement scholars who have shown what transformative social change requires. Their work makes plain that change happens when we bring together an ever-expanding network of people who recognize a common cause, a shared interest. Now, this is really a challenge when it comes to violence against women, because we have tended to treat this as a woman's issue, as a survivor's issue. Since the women's movement of the 60s and 70s, we have tended to marginalize it as an issue. We need people, regardless of their genders or life histories, to see this as their issue, not as a separate women's issue or survivor's issue. And to get there, we need to give people a compelling reason to change, to get to the kind of transformative action that's necessary. Adrienne Marie Brown, an organizer, talks about the importance of a compelling reason to change in order to overcome the status quo. If it was easy to change the problem of violence against women in our country and around the globe, we would have done it. So let's assume it's not easy, and let's look for a way to pull that ever-expanding network of people in, to give them a compelling reason to work with us for change. So it's not easy, but we've got good news here. And the good news is that thanks to the body of knowledge that Jennifer's work has contributed to and inspired, the work that betrayal trauma theory has generated over the last 25 years, you and I are uniquely positioned to use that psychological science to show people this is their issue. They have an interest in this issue, regardless of their gender or life experiences. And they have a compelling reason to act because violence against women is tangled up in the root causes of the problems that they care about, the issues that they want to make progress on. So we can show people if they want to make progress on any number of pressing public problems, a path to doing that is by also addressing intimate violence. Let's take a look. Consider healthcare for a start. This is one that makes sense to people sort of intuitively, because violence against women has obvious preventable costs to our healthcare systems when you think about things such as emergency room visits, that if we were not beating each other up, then we would not have a need to go to the ER. And people understand that the ER is an expensive form of care in the United States. But we have an opportunity through the science that betrayal trauma theory has ignited to show people that there are even more reasons for us to address the tangle between violence against women and healthcare issues in the United States. Because we have the science to show that betrayal traumas are linked with chronic health problems years later, even problems in respiratory health. There's evidence suggesting that the children of women who are victimized by their partners also have respiratory health problems. So we have a way of painting a picture that violence against women, which is entirely preventable, is tangled up with the kinds of problems that affect our healthcare system and the health of individuals in our communities. So if people care about addressing soaring healthcare costs or healthcare access, they share an interest in working with us to prevent and respond effectively to violence against women. Now, it may be when you talk about psychological health or health that people think quite quickly about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is certainly linked with betrayal traumas. And we have a chance to help them go further, to see that the consequences of betrayal trauma theory go beyond problems like PTSD to the kinds of issues that affect education. So we have a way to show people who are passionate about education access, education reform in our country, that violence against women is tangled up in disruptions in cognition and emotion regulation, things that are essential to being able to take part in and take advantage of educational opportunities. So people interested in education reform share an interest with us in ending and responding effectively to violence against women. Those same kinds of cognitive problems that go hand in hand with betrayal traumas also make getting basic needs met more difficult, contributing to things like housing and food insecurity. So if there are people in your life who are passionate about these issues, we have a way of showing them that violence against women is their issue too. For example, on my research team, we found that intimate partner violence severity was linked with poorer attention performance on laboratory tasks of attention. And in turn, that predicted problems getting basic needs met a year later. So it's not surprising then that domestic violence is a major driver of houselessness in the US. We share an interest with people who are passionate about affordable housing and addressing the housing crises across our country and finding a path forward together. Now, it's not just houselessness, of course. Violence against women is tangled up with other economic and work issues too. We know from research on my team that and around the country that abusive partners commonly sabotage women's employment, contributing to unemployment. On my team, we found that being unemployed after an incident of domestic violence was reported to law enforcement predicted severe re-victimization 6 months later. Abusive partners make workplaces more dangerous. Stalking and aggressing victims at work And this means that from sexual harassment to intimate partner violence, this kind of intimate harm affects individual workers and teams. So we have a business story to tell to business leaders, to people who care about economic development in our communities, that intimate partner violence is their issue too. We both share an interest in addressing it, stopping it, and responding effectively. Now, intimate partner violence doesn't just suddenly matter once people arrive in the workplace. It matters in the pipelines to those workplaces. So we know that sexual assault and harassment affect pipelines to work through their links to student motivation and success, affecting student career aspirations, as well as larger academic problems and even dropping out. So whether it's business leaders or university deans and leaders or tech industry leaders, anyone who cares about the STEM pipeline in our country shares an interest in addressing the problem of violence against women and harassment. And we have the science to make that case to them. We've got common ground too in unexpected places. For example, with people passionate about criminal justice reform. Too often we tend to hear conversations about criminal justice reform that sort of pit crime victims against people who are convicted of crimes. And instead, we have a body of evidence growing out of betrayal trauma and institutional betrayal trauma theories to show that the criminal justice system isn't working for many. In our work, we see the many ways that it fails victims and survivors. And so we have allies in those who are interested in criminal justice reform, in finding new ways forward, in exploring new understandings of justice and what paths to justice can look like. Of course, we could do this all day. We don't have all day. But violence against women, it's interconnected and tangled up with the issues that the people in your life care about, the pressing public problems of our time, whether it's migration and climate change, to reproductive health care and voting rights and education access. It's at the roots of all of these issues. And so we have a data-driven story to tell of why people who are passionate about progress on these issues share an interest in collaborating with us. And it's not just the problems that our science can point to. We can also point to solutions. So on my research team, we have been looking at the impact of multidisciplinary teams on outcomes for survivors and finding that lots is possible when we come together and work together in new ways. And so we have that important story to tell, particularly at a time when people are deeply skeptical about change and about working together. And we also have the data and theory from work derived from betrayal trauma theory to show that directly addressing institutional betrayal is the best path forward. So as they say in community organizing, we are the ones we've been waiting for, the ones who can make psychological science matter for translating unawareness to awareness and ultimately to action. But I'll be honest with you, we've got to do our work differently if we really want to realize this potential. And doing our work differently for those of us in higher ed has to include in developing and investing in public scholars, evolving our training to support faculty and students to do public scholarship. That is, to make their research available and accessible to the public in ways that research can be understood and used. And public scholarship will mean that universities have to change how we train and support faculty, staff, and students, and how we collaborate with each other. I'm very proud that at the University of Denver, at BU, we've been testing new ways of building and seeding multi and interdisciplinary collaborations that bring together diverse faculty and students with community partners. And indeed, that is another important piece of the puzzle, to figure out ways that the university is inviting in and connecting with communities to build shared aspirations for change, to do problem solving together. We have the tools for this kind of institutional change drawing on the trauma literature. We in the psychology field have been among the leading folks looking at how trauma-informed and community-engaged frameworks work and their impact, and we can pull on those lessons in order to prioritize equitable partnerships in research, democratize knowledge, and move our institutions and our communities forward on a path to action, to courageous action. And to acknowledge, though, that for many of us, what things have felt like over time working on social justice issues such as violence against women is sort of one step forward, two steps back, that this really has been our dance, whether we're working on violence against women or interconnected problems of racial injustice or the other great public problems of our time. But I want to stress that we're not fated to this pattern, because change is, number one, possible, and number two, something to aspire to. And that's indeed one of the things that Jennifer has modeled for us, that she has shown by the way that she has made good on that commitment, that goal to change the world, that it is indeed possible to do so. She has done that through collaborative, rich, impactful work. She has done that through the students that she has mentored, a generation of change makers, a generation of researchers and practitioners, public scholars and book authors, department chairs and university leaders, mentors and advocates. She has done it. And she has done it in a way that results in a call to us, an invitation in. She is ending this phase of her work at the University of Oregon with an invitation to us to continue with her into the next chapter, to write that chapter through the Center for Institutional Courage, to find a way to all be part of calling for and answering the call to courage. And Jennifer, your invitation couldn't be more timely. At least that's how it seems to me on the heels of writing Every 90 Seconds, where it's become clear to me that we're all needed in the work of ending intimate violence, regardless of our genders, regardless of our life histories, regardless of whether we ever saw this as our issue or not. It is our issue. We all share an interest in a future without intimate violence. So I'd like to close today with amplifying Jennifer's call to courage, her call to action, to invite you each to explore your interests in taking courageous action. Perhaps it's picking up a copy of Every 90 Seconds or reading the Courage newsletter and thinking about ways that your work can evolve to be inclusive of addressing the problem of violence against women. Maybe it's volunteering with the Center for Institutional Courage or donating. Maybe it's a bigger investment of time in how you advocate for institutional courage and change in the workplaces where you have influence. Maybe it's taking action in your community, and maybe it's something we haven't even imagined yet. And isn't that really the exciting part? Because who could have guessed some 35 years ago that Jennifer's work would begin with the study of unawareness, and that would be an essential step on the path to action and the path to courage. Thank you for the opportunity to share these reflections with you today. Thank you, Jennifer, for your mentorship, collaboration, the work, and the mark that you have left on the world.